Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of December 26, 2021. Today is the day after Christmas, and what better occasion than that to discuss Christian transhumanism. Now, as a preface, I want to emphasize the U.S. Transhumanist Party is a big tent. We don't have any litmus test for religion or lack thereof. We think people of all religious persuasions or no religious persuasion can be transhumanists and advance a better future for humanity. So I myself am an atheist, for example, but we have several Christian transhumanists as officers of the U.S. Transhumanist Party and valued members as well. And we have Jewish transhumanists, we have Buddhist transhumanists, we have Muslim transhumanists among our members, and transhumanists of other religions also. And today we're joined by a distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. We have our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. We have our Director of Community Resilience, Alexandria Black. We have our Chairman of the California Transhumanist Party, Newton Lee. And we have two guests from the Christian Transhumanist Association. Our first guest is Micah Redding, who is our advisor on religion. He is also a software developer and founder and executive director of the Christian Transhumanist Association. He is the host of the Christian Transhumanist podcast. He spent 8 years as a rock musician, has traveled extensively to places such as Kathmandu, Afghanistan, and the coasts of Africa. And in 2012, he found himself in Tahrir Square during the first election after the Egyptian revolution. As a software developer, he has worked with startups to strategically lay the groundwork for open-ended growth. He has led the development on multi-million-dollar web products and helped larger companies dramatically accelerate their development process. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he coordinates vibrant interreligious dialogue, cutting-edge art events, and public conversations on the technological singularity and the future of the human race. He is a member of Mensa, a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post and Vice Motherboard, and a speaker for TEDx and numerous other events. So quite an illustrious resume for Micah Redding. And also joining us from Australia is Jonathan Gunnell, who is a member of the Christian Transhumanist Association. So welcome to Jonathan. And now I want to start the conversation on Christian transhumanism by turning the floor over to Micah to tell us essentially what the key principles of Christian transhumanism are, why in Micah's view Christianity and transhumanism are compatible, and what we can do to effectively persuade more Christians to embrace the ideas of transhumanism while remaining Christian and professing their Christianity. So welcome, Micah. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to talk with you all, and love to hear your thoughts and questions about this kind of stuff. I know that it's a really unusual thing for a lot of people to encounter a connection between Christianity and transhumanism. And I get that actually from both directions. I hear Christians who are really baffled that someone could a Christian could approach transhumanism, or they're just don't understand what it is, or are weirded out by the concepts or so forth. And I also get that kind of incredulous reaction from transhumanists who are like, how could you be a Christian and be a transhumanist at the same time? And so I know that these are the kinds of things that people very frequently are wrestling with. So I'll just say, I'll kind of give my perspective on it. And I want to say, just to the larger conversation, I think this is really important. If transhumanists want to advocate for productive technological projects to make a better world, then, particularly if you want to advocate for that in a political way, or as a kind of social project at a large scale, then you really have to grapple with the fact that there are billions of religious people in the world. Billions of people for whom religion is a very significant part of their identity, their ethics, their sense of purpose, who they are, their family, how they think about society and the world, and so forth. And so I think this is a really important thing for transhumanists to be considering. So as a Christian and a transhumanist myself, I would say that Christianity, and I've been saying this for a lot of years, Christianity is transhumanism. Christianity is a kind of transhumanism. And this goes back to foundational principles. It goes back to Genesis 1, first page of the Bible, in which it depicts God as this cultivating creator of life, who then turns and creates humanity and says, I'm going to make humanity into my image and my likeness. I'm going to call them to do the same kind of creative, cultivating work that I do. And this has been historically understood as this call to science and technology, to fill the earth, to cultivate it with life, to use tools, to create tools, and so forth, to bring forth better life and a better world. And that is not just something that we're coming up with now. It's gone back all the way in history to the early centuries of Christianity, to key figures like Sir Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism, who understood Christianity in precisely this way. And so, a key thing for me would just be the Lord's Prayer, which is something that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. It's prayed by millions of Christians every week around the world. And it says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And what that prayer is asking for is that earth become more and more and more like heaven, like the kingdom of God, like empowered, vibrant, creative, thriving life that is eternal, life that is immortal, life that is thriving in every dimension, right? This is the Christian idea at its heart and at its root. And so the Christian Transhumanist Association, we have an affirmation that was kind of developed in cooperation with different people, from clergy to theologians to so forth. And it basically says, we believe that God has a mission to transform and renew creation, the entire cosmos, and that we are called to participate in that. We are called to participate in the work of God. We are called to use science and technology to participate in the work of God. And so that's what it boils down to, that we as Christians feel like the calling of God, the mission of Christianity, the mission that we are called into, is to use science and technology to radically transform the world, humanity, and the cosmos itself, to bring forth more, greater, thriving life. And so that's where I come from. Now, I think there's a lot of questions that people are going to raise, which is, why is it that not all Christians see it this way? And I would be happy to talk about that, and maybe some particular questions you have about how that works. Maybe I'll just say something quickly about how to connect to that larger story. So I just mentioned the Lord's Prayer, which millions of Christians say every week. That idea, this narrative, this idea of what we are doing in the world, in the cosmos, and so forth, which goes from Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation, and is all throughout the Christian scriptures and Christian history and the celebration of Christmas. If you sing Christmas carols, you're going to hear it there. If you listen closely, it's transhumanist all the way through. And that storyline really comes down to, how do we help make a better world? How do we help bring forth thriving life? And people, of course, are going to disagree about that and have different ideas about that. And so the question for transhumanists is, how do we bring in that conversation where we say, here's the way we can use science and technology and these radical new possibilities that are in our near future to create a thriving world. And it's not just going to be one where we abandon the past, but it's actually going to be one that's a fulfillment of the past, of our greatest dreams, of our greatest hopes, of our greatest stories and poetry and so forth. And so I'll just point out one example. Yesterday at the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, I think it was Brian Nelson, who is the leader of NASA, he talked about the significance of this incredible scientific achievement and related it back to the poetry of Psalm 91, where thousands of years ago, a shepherd in a field looked up at the sky and was driven to profound religious wonder. Right? And when we connect those things, as he did in that speech, I think we unleash incredible sense of meaning in ourselves as humans, and the incredible potential to coordinate and cooperate to build a better world together. And so I think that's where we need to be looking, and what we need to be working with. How do we bring those two things together? How do we connect science and technology to the larger story of ourselves as humans, as a species, and where we're going in the cosmos? And so I'm sure there will be lots of great provocative questions about that, but that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I think where the Christian Transhumanist Association is coming from as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction, Micah, and certainly it has already provoked some interesting comments and observations from our viewers. But first, I would like to acknowledge Flying Donkey 420 for the generous super chat. Thank you very much. We always appreciate the generosity of our listeners. Our friend Scott Schiff points out that John Templeton was a Christian who supported life-extending research. And of course, there are other Christians who are very much of that persuasion as well. And we appreciate allies within the broader Christian community where and when we encounter them. Our longtime member and viewer, Mike DeVerde, points out that he is a Christian, he is a transhumanist, and he has never felt a conflict between the two. And he also relates his background that he was an atheist for 40 years, but he has been a Christian for the last 20 years. Now, also, it's interesting to note that our friend John H. states that he used to be a Christian. During his Christian days, he would have regarded salvation as the only actual and meaningful transhumanism, and he would have had little to no interest in secular transhumanism. And I've sometimes encountered that reaction among Christians as well. For instance, when I published my illustrated children's book, Death is Wrong, in 2013, and it received a lot of media attention in 2014, including from the Christian blogosphere. And some of the Christian authors were making statements to the effect of that they sympathized with my recognition that death is wrong and that it is unjust, but they thought that using science and technology to address or solve the problem of death was hubristic, and trust in God was the only thing that was required. And of course, intuitively, my thought would be, well, for generations, people have trusted in a God or gods to resolve this predicament, and yet it didn't quite work out for them. So even if one is of a religious persuasion, clearly something additional is needed to overcome death in this world. But a lot of Christians don't seem to recognize that. They seem to still believe in some sort of Platonic ideal of an afterlife rather than even the more accurately Christian view of resurrection in the flesh. So, Micah, I'm wondering how we can get across to people who may have this desire to overcome death and suffering and mortality, but they think the only way to do that is through embracing Jesus Christ, and science and technology and any actions we can take in this world have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned this Platonic idea of an afterlife or of immortality or of heaven, right? And unfortunately, this has become the kind of thing that typically gets associated with Christianity. What a lot of people think of as Christian is that there's this kind of immaterial heaven somewhere that when we die our souls go there, and that's it, that's the story, that's what we're signing up for. And I sometimes pejoratively call this like escapism Christianity, and it's really antithetical to the historic Christian tradition, which you kind of alluded to. You go back to like the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and the Christianity at the time was absolutely ridiculed by the kind of philosophical Platonic mainstream, because they were saying, no, resurrection of the body, immortality of the body is what we're talking about. Immortality in the cosmos, on planet Earth, and so forth, right? And so this is what you get in the gospel stories. You get Jesus coming physically back from the dead, physically overcoming death, physically triumphing over those things. And that's what's promised to the early Christians. And so you have in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, Christians actually talking about what is the science of physical immortality? What is the science of bringing back and overcoming the dead? But this it's a popular kind of misunderstanding. Unfortunately, I think people who are scholars and theologians, people like Anglican theologian N.T. Wright, are kind of helping the mainstream to recover a more biblical and more authentically Christian view, which says, actually, Christianity is not about abandoning this cosmos for some other world. It's actually about the transformation of this cosmos. And that's never gone away from, if you read like theologians, if you read people who, are studying it, that's always been what has been said. I read C.S. Lewis, one of the most popular authors of the 20th century. These folks will emphasize, no, we're talking about physical flesh overcoming death. That's what the Christian hope is. And so for me, when I talk to Christians who've maybe lost touch with that a little bit, I want to just put it back in focus. Say, Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You look at the end of Revelation. What is it? It's the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth to transform the world and bring about physical immortality in the cosmos. And so mostly when we have those conversations, people are like, oh yeah, okay, that's right. That is what the story is. But maybe I just lost touch with it for a minute. And we all do that. We kind of lose track of what the real story is, or what our real mission is, and so forth. But I think that's where that reorientation, we need to keep doing that. We need to say, okay, what's the story? And the Christian story that you get in Christmas carols, you get in Christian history, you get in Orthodox theology, is that God is wanting to transform and renew earth, the cosmos, and all of it, and we are called to participate in that. And I think if we just keep pointing to that, then people get it, because that's what's there. That's the real story.
Yes, thank you for those remarks, Micah. And our friend Mike Lazine states that he loves C.S. Lewis. The Chronicles of Narnia is one of his favorite fantasy series, and he recognizes that it has Christian ties, like with Aslan the lion being a form of Christ. Now, our friend Alan Crowley believes that Plato laid out all the basics, Christianity just dressed it up. Of course, it morphed later on. So he doesn't think it's a misunderstanding, even though he does recognize that the way you portrayed Christianity, Micah, is what it says indeed, but that doesn't seem to be mainstream Christianity today. So it does seem to me that Neoplatonism really did essentially infiltrate Christianity during the 3rd century, and especially when Emperor Constantine and his successors in the 4th century tried to consolidate Christianity's hold on the Roman Empire. I think what they did was, for pragmatic purposes, try to essentially blend Christianity with as many pagan elements as possible to make it palatable to the general public. And Platonic philosophy was, of course, very popular in the ancient world. And the Platonic concept that this is not the true reality, that there is some sort of other, more perfect reality, the world of forms, was blended with this notion that because this life is a life of suffering and suboptimality, to put it lightly, there is some sort of perfect ideal afterlife that is not the same as this life. So I wonder, can this notion be corrected to some extent in terms of the popular perception of Christianity, the focus on this world being regained rather than so many people, as they do now, putting all of their hopes and their faith in some otherworldly existence that technically Christianity doesn't even promise?
Yeah, so I think there's the question of I think there is this effort, which I think makes sense for early Christians to figure out how to translate their story, which was ultimately a narrative, right, into these kind of philosophical terms. And some of that translation involves some maybe unfortunate choices, but I think we can step back from kind of maybe relitigating some of that and actually focus on the question of how do we do this practically. And so if you look at it, I think Jesus in the Gospels calls his followers to help heal the sick, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, raise the dead, all these kinds of things, right? And that has historically been understood in very pragmatic ways. The reason that so many hospitals around, at least where I live, where almost everywhere I've seen, they have names like St. Thomas, St. Mary's, and so forth. It's because Christians understood that their faith was calling them to practically engage in making a better world, using science and technology to actively heal the sick, right? To actively clothe the naked, to actively feed the hungry. So these are things that are spelled out. They are called for, and that through Christian history, we've understood as a calling to use science and technology, to advance science and technology for these purposes. So I think we just have to keep turning to this. It's not, this idea that Christians have lost touch with it. I think it's true, but it's also maybe less true than it sometimes seems. Because I think at the end of the day, we do remember what the story is, that we can talk about all kinds of philosophy. And at the end of the day, we do know that we should be helping to heal the sick, right? We do know that, even if we've maybe gotten a little bit misconstrued in how we're thinking about some of these things, we do know that ultimately we do need to be doing these practical things. So I think it really comes down to retelling the Christian story, retelling the biblical story for Christians, and I think it shakes us out of the kind of complacency and stupor that we sometimes get into, and helps us to recover and rediscover the things that are truly important. And of course, that's what ideally Christians are trying to do every week, but it's also what the Christian Transhumanist Association is trying to help people do as well. Point back to those things that are truly significant that we should be working on.
Yes, indeed. And To reinforce that, our friend T.J. Wass points out God helps those who help themselves. So that's a call for practical action in this world. And then also our friend Daniel Twett writes, anything that gets people thinking in science fictional kinds of ways is useful. Even science fiction can do that, but I think he's also referring to systems of thought like Christianity, which can posit these possibilities for a dramatically better future, a dramatically different future for humankind if properly understood. Now, I think this is a good occasion to bring Jonathan into the conversation, and I would ask Jonathan to please introduce yourself, tell us about your involvement with the Christian Transhumanist Associations, and your thoughts on Christianity and transhumanism.
Thanks very much, Janadi. Yeah, look, I've been a Christian since my youth. I got interested in transhumanism, reading Ray Kurzweil. And eventually I thought, well, there must be some other Christian transhumanists out there. So I went Googling and found Micah very easily. My day job, I'm a structural engineer. I work in an innovation centre. We're working with some emerging technologies. So I sort of moved my career sideways in that space. I think I'd like to pick up on what you said at the start, Janadi, when you talked about the importance of, the question is, how do we build bridges between different groups of people who are portrayed as, in some senses, having a natural level of hostility? I think for Christians need to see in transhumanism, and particularly I was reading Romans chapter 2 this week, where Paul talks about those who are a law unto themselves, where their own conscience is reflecting God's law. And we need to see that when we find it and support it and work. And that's an important thing for Christians, to not have a kind of siege mentality, but to understand that there is goodness in common humanity out there, and we need to build those bridges and support those. And on the same time, there's always a little bit of hostility coming from atheism. I think the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they call themselves, Dawkins et al., I don't think they did a good job to advance the conversation in terms of bridge building, because if Jesus is not who I believe he is, then he's at least an archetype of the highest moral archetype to have emerged out of this simulation or creation, whatever it is that we're all in at the moment. So the archetypes that we have, and by that I'm talking in the Jungian sense, where these archetypes co-evolved with humanity. I think it's really important to understand who Jesus was in terms of that archetype, and what kind of spirituality will sustain transhumanism in the future. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for transhumanism to reach out into Christianity and say, look, these are the things that we agree with in Christianity, that we believe in loving and making peace with your enemies. We believe in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22, where it talks about the ideal human characteristics in spirituality being love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, humility, self-control. And I thank God for the Baptists drilling that into me in my youth, even though I probably don't have quite such a conservative faith these days. But seeing the good Christians need to see the good in transhumanism, and the transhumanists and the atheists need to see the good and in Christianity also, and respect, as Micah said, the extent to which Christianity preserved civilization, invented hospitals, saved a lot of learning, and right through the Dark Ages became a means of keeping societies together. So I hope there's some thought-provoking insights there.
Yes, absolutely there are. Thank you, Jonathan, for those remarks. And I will point out, I've said over the years, I'm an atheist, but I'm not a militant atheist. And explicitly, I don't seek to deconvert anybody. If anybody wants to have a discussion with me about why I don't believe in any God or gods, I'll be happy to explain. But in most of my interactions with people, my focus is practical. It's on this world. It's about how we can improve life here for all humans. And the fact is, we inhabit a common reality, no matter what our philosophical or religious beliefs or lack thereof. We deal with many of the same challenges day to day. And any serious philosophical or religious system would have had to grapple with the predicament of human beings in this world and to come up with ways of dealing with that predicament, which are adaptive to a certain extent. So there is wisdom in religious traditions that shouldn't be discounted or thrown away just because it stems from a religious tradition. Even someone like Ayn Rand, a thinker whom I was greatly influenced by, who also was an atheist, pointed out religion is an early form of philosophy. And it was a way of people, particularly prior to the scientific revolution, for trying to make systematic sense of the world, for trying to arrive at insights and integrate logic and rationality, as well as Thomas Aquinas had done, whom Ayn Rand admired greatly as well. Our friend Scott Schiff from the Ayn Rand fan club, who had a great interview with me a few months ago, points out the mistake that some Ayn Rand fans make is thinking that they have to change everyone to the same thought process. And Scott is different in that regard. He says, if people are for life extension, he's not trying to nitpick their beliefs until there's more time. So let's achieve radical life extension. Let's solve a lot of the pressing problems in our world. And then we will have a lot more time at leisure to delve into philosophical differences and perhaps try to figure out exactly where we might differ and what the truth might be. And in the meantime, let's try to find the common ground. Let's try to find the areas where we align and where we can take the next steps. Now, with regard to your remarks on a simulation type of hypothesis, our friend TJ Wass points out that Elon Musk believes in the simulation theory, where we all live in a video game created by future humans or artificial intelligence. And that to him sounds like believing in God with extra steps. Now, I myself am more of the persuasion that Occam's razor suggests that the simplest explanation is that this is the real reality, the ultimate reality, and the evidence for that is essentially the same as the evidence, any evidence for us living in a simulation type of scenario. So it's better to pick the simpler variant. It's more economical, it's more elegant in that regard, and say that we are in the real reality unless we have evidence to the contrary. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on this, Jonathan.
Yeah, look, I guess when I was one of my earliest memories is asking myself the question, why is there something other than nothing? I must have been about 4 or 5 years old at the time. And you've all heard various versions of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. I find it compelling. I find that the rebuttals to it to be somewhat incoherent. If you posit a first cause, if you posit an unmoved mover, classically people will come back and say, well, who moved the unmoved mover? Which is a bit of a kind of a nonsensical question because we just said there wasn't one. But that seems to divert people's thinking, and you end up in either, to cut a long story short, you're either looking at a series of infinite regression into the past of causes, or you're looking at a brute fact where something just exists. And both of those, I find both of those deeply philosophically unrewarding, dissatisfying. So another way of putting it is that the first mover is completely external to this chain of cause and effect that is commonly described. Or another way of putting that is, as Aquinas put it, that the creation event and causation is utterly different, of a different order to what we see of causation today, or as I like to put it, I like to say that causation, at least as we know it, is a feature of this simulation, because otherwise our understanding of causation is somehow incomplete. And then once you start seeing the simulation as a work of technology, which I believe it basically to be, you can then start putting a technological lens over a whole lot of things, and start to ask, okay, how do these things work? How does that work? How does consciousness work? We want to potentially, transhumanists have a lot of discussions about consciousness and how do we continue our consciousness? And that starts to become a technological question to say, well, is the technology to transfer the consciousness out of our wetware into some other substrate, when we talk about substrate independence consciousness, is that technology that's available from inside the simulation, or is that only available from external to the simulation? Once you see it as a technology, then the master of that technology can obviously reach in and incarnate, as we've just seen at Christmas time, and present him or herself, or him as Jesus was, as the perfect human, as something to inspire and say, this is what I really intend my creation to grow into. So once there's a technology there, then and a technological view, I think a lot of other philosophical questions will fall into place and will help to bring a different lens to the problems that we're all trying to solve.
Yes, thank you for that explanation, Jonathan. And indeed, it's interesting as an atheist throughout my life, I've had difficulty grasping the common posited Christian propositions that God is kind of outside of the laws of causality, the laws of the universe, etc. But the closest I came to trying to see that perspective, or how it would operate from a logical perspective, relates to my experience playing strategy computer games or world building computer games, which I did earlier in my life. And for instance, with a game like Civilization, one has a kind of external view on a world, and one takes the role of this external guide of a society, of a civilization, and yet one is outside of that entire world. So the analogy to what you're saying, Jonathan, would be essentially God, or a God would be like a computer game player, and we would all be within this computer game world, in essence. And I understand it might not be a perfect analogy, but it's the closest I can find to trying to conceptualize that perspective and still have it make logical sense. Again, for me, the Occam's razor argument still comes in, and I don't have a reason to believe that we're in a game, because I don't see anything different about the world that would hold if we were in a game, and wouldn't hold if we were not. And unless I can find a way to test that in some way and have empirical evidence in favor of one side of that hypothesis or the other, I'm going to assume the simplest one. Now, could it conceivably be possible that we're in a Matrix type of scenario, for instance? Well, yes, but then we'd have to have that empirical evidence like the character of Neo in the Matrix had, where he could actually see the machines running that simulation, so to speak, and he could find a way to get out of the simulation. I don't see a way of doing that with all due respect to Elon Musk, for all my differences with him. But it's an interesting conversation nonetheless. Now, I know we have a lot of interest among our panelists to engage in extensions of this conversation. So, Alexandria, I'm wondering if you're able to pose some of your questions.
Hey, what did I already ask about? Well, I made some comments in chat you might look at, but mainly I'm wondering, how do we reconcile this with especially some of, I hate to name that podcaster, but the one that's wanting to blame transhumanism for everything being done medically in the world at the moment. That was one question. We'll just take it from there.
Sure, I'm not familiar with the. Oh, Micah, you've got this one.
I don't know if I've got this one. I can try to weigh in on it. So the thing is that Christianity is fundamentally future focused, right? So Christians use terms like eschatology and apocalypse to talk about the future. The future that we're aspiring to, the future that we're moving to, the future that we believe God wants, the future that maybe is being enacted in some way, right? And so when we think about the future, this is one area where Christians and transhumanists are like right next to each other, right? Because we're so focused on the future and the possibilities of the future, and it kind of changes the shape of life now, right? If you're a dedicated transhumanist, you may do things that people find very strange or weird. You may sign up for cryonics. You may engage in some serious life extension regimen, all this kind of stuff. You're going to make different kinds of choices, right? Well, the same thing is true for Christians and Christianity. And that's both the power of it and the danger. Because as soon as we start talking about a radically different future, if we skew that in some way, it can distort and destroy us, right? It can turn us from people who are very engaged in building things to maybe saying, well, the singularity is going to happen anyway, so I don't need to do anything myself, right? And the same thing happens with Christians, right? And so you get these pockets of Christianity where people take the future in a weird direction, where all of a sudden they become very pessimistic about the future, or they think it's going to look in a particular way. And once they get started kind of skewing that future off from the positive, participatory, optimistic future that Scripture and Christianity, in the mainstream talks about, then you get into some very dark places. And of course, at that point, you have to say that everyone who's also talking about the future but talking about it slightly different, is your arch enemy, right? So the transhumanists who are trying to make a better world are now our arch enemy. The other Christians who are trying to make a better world are now our arch enemy, right? Like I've been, these same kind of people that you're referring to have, talked about me as ushering in the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff. I'm just a normal Christian. I go to church, I participate in Bible class, I do all this stuff, right? But as soon as you get that weird future that you're locked in on, then everybody but you is the devil, right? And so that's the danger. But it's the danger of things that are truly powerful. It's the danger of technology. It's the danger of religion. Once you get locked into something that's truly powerful, you have the opportunity to use it in both good ways and bad ways. And that's what we see, unfortunately. And so that's what we have to wrestle with. We have to take on the challenges, oppose the people who are using this for bad ends and who are perpetrating, bad misinformation. And we have to work for the good.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And it's important to point out that throughout history, extreme hostilities existed not just between religious and non-religious people or Christians and atheists, but there has been a lot of vicious rivalry among people who espoused various brands of Christianity, even, say, in the early history, during the 3rd through the 5th centuries, there was a huge rivalry between what we now think of as conventional Christianity, which was Nicene Christianity, and Arian Christianity. And then, of course, there were the wars of religion during the 16th and 17th centuries. And even now, there are sometimes bitter feuds among various Christian denominations. And sometimes it's easier, for instance, for somebody who might consider him or herself Christian to get along with certain atheists or practitioners of other religions than to get along with other Christians for whatever reason. So I think it's important to avoid thinking of any group of people who use a particular word to describe their beliefs as being ideologically monolithic. And I would even extend that to transhumanists as well, because there are some people who call themselves transhumanists who, I frankly regret that they've associated themselves with our movement, and I don't need to go into who they are, but I would much rather even associate with somebody who is very conventionally religious and skeptical of radical life extension and manifesting all the reservations about transhumanism that such a person would, than I would with some of those self-professed transhumanists. So I think a lot of it is a matter not just of professed ideology or labels, but of personality, of temperament, of disposition toward the treatment of ideas and the treatment of people. I wonder what your thoughts on that would be.
Yeah, I wanted to say, we're talking a little bit about the diversity of ideas within Christianity, both positive and negative. I think very understandably and reasonably, many people have been exposed to some of the worst versions of that, right? The worst things are often the loudest. And what's interesting is that that's true for transhumanism as well. And most of the time when I talk to Christians or just people who are not familiar with the transhumanist conversation, this is actually the clarifying thing that we have to discuss, is that not everyone who is a transhumanist agrees with everything else that all the other transhumanists are saying, right? And so we hear about the worst versions of transhumanism, and we hear about the worst ideas in transhumanism, and for many people, that's just all that transhumanism is, right? And I think that a lot of people here would argue, no, there's something wholesome, there's something good. Some of these bad things that are out there are not truly expressive of what our community and movement is about, right? And so, and I would argue the same is true for Christianity by far. The things you hear, the crazy people who have TV shows and so forth, these not only do not represent all of Christianity, they don't usually represent the majority of Christianity, and certainly do not represent the historic majority of Christianity. And because most people are quiet, right? That's just, that's how it is. So I think this is something we all have to keep in mind in these conversations, because it goes both ways. The worst examples on all sides are not the truly representative examples that we should be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Micah. And Alexandria, you have a follow-up question?
Yes, after years of us begging for funding, and now we're getting it, and we see it not adhering to our goals, that it's become a bit more of a money chase, and now we're useless to them. So how would you address this? And also I'm interested particularly if Jonathan has worked with Brendan Clark in Australia, who I think ran for Science Party a while ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And I want to elaborate a little bit on what Alexandria is saying. So there have been recently certain, let's say, controversies within the life extension community, just as the field has been starting to get essentially an order of magnitude greater funding than it has gotten in prior years, where all of a sudden there's a new group of people entering the field who consider themselves to be more oriented toward the mainstream, who are essentially saying, well, now the field has gotten a lot more funding, so we need to be more, quote, strategically conservative in our rhetoric. And the people who drove this field to become what it is, who grew this field, who advocated really the original transhumanist ideas or the program for rejuvenation and radical life extension, are increasingly being seen as inconvenient, and various attempts are being made to essentially cast them aside, sometimes in extremely heavy-handed ways. And we as the Transhumanist Party are trying to resist that tendency and really champion the original innovators of transhumanism, the people to whom this field owes its recent growth and its current state. So we're trying to get as many allies as possible in that. And I wonder, is there a danger of becoming too mainstream in the sense that then one is vulnerable to entryism from people who don't really want the radical transformative vision of the future? They want something else: money, power, respectability within the very narrow confines of the status quo. I think that's what Alexandria was alluding to in her remarks. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I haven't worked with Brendan Clark, but I will Google that name and see if I can reach out. Thanks for the tip there. Yeah, I did want to also pick up, John H. raised the no true Scotsman fallacy. And yeah, that's one lens to apply. Another lens to apply is 1 John chapter 2, verse 8, which says anybody who doesn't walk the way Jesus does, then they're not a genuine Christian. And I'd like to, acknowledge Gennady saying, that groups aren't all the same. They're not homogenous. In fact, there's a cognitive bias on that you might have heard of called the out-group homogeneity bias. And if you want to start to build bridges between groups of people, especially in such a shockingly polarized discourse that we have now, the first thing to do is to see that no group is homogenous, and that we should be reaching out and we should be selectively agreeing with parts of what people say. I think that's a tremendous way of breaking down the walls. But yeah, there certainly are a lot of professing Christians out there who are doing exactly contrary to the things that Jesus would do. The existence of such people is predicted in Scripture, in the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13, and in later prophetic writings in the epistles. So by no, I'm certainly neither Michael nor I nor anyone at the CTA is going to defend the indefensible for professing Christians who are not really representing Christ the way that Christ intended.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, for those insights. And I know David Shoemaker had some remarks as well. So David, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Gennady. And for those that don't know, I classify myself as a Christian transhumanist, and I'm actually a voting member of CTA as well. And don't participate in the online discussions as often as I would like, but maybe that will change. So I drew up a long list of questions before this because I was really excited for today's discussion. And Micah, Jonathan, and Gennady, between your conversations, you've done a very good job of crossing most of those questions off of the list. So here's where I want to go. I want to talk about fear and faith, because I think that is the basis for a lot of what we see. So what I mean by that is fear drives me into a place where I am comfortable in the current misery that I am in, and I would rather stay in this current misery that I know than venture out and take a chance on change and making something else a better reality. So as I talk to people when they discover the Christian side of me as well as the transhumanist side of me, if it's hard sometimes to find an opening to have this discussion, because when you first start to talk, if it's fear that you're dealing with, people retreat into that fear, and it's really hard to say anything. So I'm glad this day after Christmas, we're having this discussion here, because the one opening that I do find, oddly enough, is around tradition, which can be a form of rigidity, can be a form of keeping the same, but it also allows an opportunity to explore what those things mean. Why is the birth of Jesus near the shortest daylight time of the year, representing light coming into the world, and what that birth means, and how ancient societies celebrated that thousands of years before Jesus walked the earth, and the kind of change making that having this light in the form of Jesus coming into the earth, or physical light coming into the earth, brings us change that can be more comforting. So I'm just interested, Micah, primarily in what you think of these comments, and if you use any of this type of strategy as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think this idea of the role of fear and what often goes with fear, which is things like selfishness, things like working at zero-sum games and so forth, working against others, looking, being resistant to being humble, things like this, emerge from our fear, right? And so when you really think about something like tackling disease, tackling aging, tackling the problems that face us as a world, or you think about traveling into space, trying to open new frontiers and so forth. Of course, what's going to come up with that is a huge amount of fear. And as we become a more interconnected world, then that fear has free reign to kind of multiply over and over and replicate itself in us and create division that leads to antagonism that, if unchecked, could lead to at least stagnation and perhaps the destruction of the world, right? And so we have to find a way of tackling fear and overcoming it. And from a Christian perspective, we would just actually, describe that as faith, right? Faith is that ability to move forward into a positive future in the face of fear, not denying the dangers, not denying the challenges, but the ability to move forward anyway. And so this is where I think tradition is really helpful, because it reminds us of this, so, I grew up with so much. I grew up in a religious environment. I grew up with, all these songs in my background. They're kind of stuck in the back of my head, all this kind of stuff. And it would only be really years and years after first having heard them that the meanings of them would kind of percolate up. And I would be able to say, oh, this is what we've been singing about all along. This is what we've been talking about all along. And so in a way, those traditions encode moments in our past where people were able to step forward in the face of fear and overcome it. And if you think about, Jesus being born into the edges of the Roman Empire in the first century, a dramatically different world than ours, and the people who are around him dreaming of a radically different future, not defined by the Roman Empire, not defined by the kind of political and physical ideas that were available then, but actually defined by this radical vision of humans transformed to be the likeness of God. This is a crazy thing. It's fear-inducing, and the only way to overcome it is through through faith, right? To step forward in the face of that fear and say, we're going after this anyway. And that's what our traditions, the best traditions we have, at least, encode and help us remember. And they do help us to face fear in our current context and overcome it as well.
Yes, thank you, Micah. And this motivated a lot of comments among our viewers. And one of the comments, it's interesting that John H. points this out, Christians actually appropriated some pagan holidays in order to make conversions less objectionable. And that policy was openly admitted in the Catholic grade school that John went to. It was admitted with a certain pride in the supposed cleverness of the policy. Mike Lazine points out Constantine was one of the promoters who tried to make Christianity more palatable to others. And indeed, Constantine himself actually did not convert to Christianity until his deathbed, and he maintained a lot of the pagan symbolism and pagan traditions up until that time, but tried to integrate them into the Christian worldview that was being formed at the time. But Christians are not the only ones who have done this. In the Soviet Union, for instance, a lot of Christian holiday tradition was actually converted to the New Year's celebration that is still the most popular holiday in the Russian-speaking world. And there are a lot of parallels. For instance, Santa Claus has become a figure called Grandfather Frost, and Grandfather Frost has very similar appearance to Santa Claus, long beard, the hat, not overweight generally, unlike Santa Claus, but he brings presents, and it's just a week later in the year. And there are many other similarities. The tree, for instance, the ornaments, the sense of celebration and kind of overlooking the troubles of the world for a short period of time are very much present. And I think in the early 20th century, the communist regime had a similar challenge. They wanted rapid adoption of the new order of things, so to speak. So it was easier to blend that with aspects of the old order, whatever could be salvaged and transmuted, so to speak. So there is also a point that was made about overcoming fear. And fear is an obstacle for many individuals for trying to understand and really build bridges with others. And Jason Geringer pointed that out in the YouTube chat as well, that people of whatever persuasion or denomination, when they lash out at others with hostility, they may be driven more by fear than anything else. And I think the challenge is, how do we overcome that? How do we build more bridges? So we'd like to thank Alan Crowley for his generous super chat. And he wonders, why don't Christians join the USTP? And I think some Christians do. We have a good sampling here within our panel, but there are others who may be held back by certain points of view or certain misconceptions. So I invite some commentary on what some of those misconceptions might be, in addition to what we've discussed already, and how can we resolve them in perhaps the easiest possible way. So without really deconverting anybody, as I've said, we don't really want to do that. But if there is a genuine misunderstanding, and that's what prompts the fear, how do we get across to these people?
I'd like to hear what Jonathan thinks about that.
Yeah. Look, I think what I said before, I think the best way to reach out and get people to like you is to tell them the parts of their program that you really agree with. Where you're never going to get two humans to agree on exactly everything unless they're engaging in the party spirit kind of which is spoken against in Scripture, or the extreme partisanship that goes on in politics these days. So just to reiterate what we said before, the way to get Christians to join in with transhumanism is to say, hey, you guys have got something really valuable to add here. We really respect your traditions. We really respect the way that you perceive humans as able to transform, that you perceive each individual human as valuable, that you place a really high priority on a bunch of values that we can also agree on a good swag of those values, if not all of them. That's the way to bring people in, and not being really certain of yourself is a great virtue as well. To always be exploring, to always be ready to change, to say, look, we're on a journey. This is my best current understanding. Now that current understanding may change in the future with new facts, and because this is a fundamentally Christian thing. I hear people saying, Sam Harris says that faith is believing things sometimes completely in contradiction of plain evidence, which that's not faith in the scriptures, because faith in scripture in Hebrews chapter 1, faith is the assurance of things unseen. It's not the assurance of things seen. So you can share that with Christians too, and say, look, the age of the earth thing that is seen now, we can see that, and so to say, look, we all know that there's things that we don't know. We know that there's a future beyond the limits of human understanding, and anything that's outside your limit of understanding is what you see as faith. Gennady, you have faith that God doesn't exist, and that's the same kind of faith that I have that he does. So I think once we can start building those sorts of common grounds and say, look, we're all searching after a better world, a better future, and we really appreciate the way Christians have sought to build hospitals, to build educational facilities, the long tradition that they have of promoting, particularly in America, promoting a really highly ethical and progressive business environment. I think these are the things that we can do to draw Christians into the movement and say, look, you're valuable, you've got some tremendous insights. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And in our chat, Alexandria points out that community resilience builds on a shared convergence, and Jonathan has a good outlook. So some words of praise for your comments. And David, I think you had a follow-up comment as well.
Yes, I do. And I think it goes right along with what we're talking about now. In our internal chat, one of the other members here asked what a big hurdle to Christians joining might be. So as a Christian myself, I would say that it's when I run across this idea of an either or mindset, it has to be this way or it has to be this way. It can't somehow be bigger than both of those. So I think this reductionism of saying that, well, let's just use the example that was out there. Is the Earth 6,000 years old, or is it 4.5 billion years old? Okay. Can you hold both of those ideas in your mind together and maybe glean what is scientific from one and gain what was philosophical in another, and come to a greater understanding than just fiercely defending one side or the other? And maybe that's not the best example, but what I'm trying to give is an idea that you need to open yourself up. And I'm not just talking to Christians. I'm talking to transhumanists saying, well, it's got to be this way. This is the evidence. And if it says something else, well, you're wrong. To me, that sounds an awful lot like dogma. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that there's probably a lot of people on this panel that are not really fond of dogma, that we want to be more open than that. And we want to embrace all the possibilities, but that is not a license to just think whatever you want. When I talk about embracing something that's open and either or and holding them, then use that actively in your mind to come to a better solution. So that's kind of the follow-up comment that I had. Thank you, Gennady.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, David. And we have a comment from Jason as well. He says, you have to take a step back and try to see the big picture. So perhaps ideas that seem to be at odds with one another based on a narrower interpretation can cohere in a big picture sense. And with that, I would like to ask Jason if he wants to elaborate on this or has any other comments or questions. Jason, I think you're on mute.
In my personal journey through, Christianity, I would say that my concept of God has grown. There's a time period when Edwin Hubble, if you remember him, when he was looking through the telescope and he noticed that these stars, some of them were actually huge galaxies far, far away. So up until that point, they thought that all of them stars were just stars. And so the universe was so big. Well, as soon as he figured out that those are actually galaxies bazillion light years away, the whole size of the universe in that instant got much larger for him. That is sort of similar to what I would say that, my concept of God has risen. And I would say that you could have two identical people, and one of them would be a Christian, the other would say he's Christian transhumanist. And the only difference between the two would be that the Christian transhumanist is being a good person, not because he's trying to look for treasures in heaven or he's afraid of going to hell, because once you got longevity, escape velocity, and you're going to have super longevity, the same kind of arguments don't work. I mean, if religion is something to try to get people to be a good person, well, that kind of argument of, you better do that or you're going to go to hell don't work anymore if you're going to live, almost forever. So, the transhumanist is a good person because he believes it's the right thing to do, and not because there's some, mandate from a deity to be that way, and, the fear, people will be convinced that if their way is not right, then that means they're going to hell or something. And, there's really only one answer. It's easy to see in hindsight after everything has happened. And, you look at how things, oh, yeah, that's what that prophecy meant, and it's easy to do that with everything. Well, that's what I think is going to happen here. After the time goes by, there'll be a lot of Christians that look back and be, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. That's what it meant, So you have to kind of just step back and look at the big picture, that these things that are happening and the rise of technology, is more the manifestation of some of those prophecies, and that, just because you get a deeper meaning into what the story meant doesn't mean that it was all wrong. It just means that you perceived it in a more shallow fashion at the time, like, for instance, the story of Joshua, when they're going around the city, 7 times. And, just because, when looking at it from a military perspective, there was the prostitute that they were able to secure a room. And, when you go around 7 days, that gives them 7 days to be putting up a team of dudes up the rope, and just because you could see a military path forward and it wasn't magical, the walls just happened to fall down, that doesn't make the story any less relevant. It doesn't, just because you can see farther into the situation doesn't make it not true necessarily. Just means you gain a larger, more in-depth perspective of it. So, that's why I see zero, conflict necessarily with humanism and Christianity, really, and therefore, transhumanism too. So, yeah, back to you, Gennady.
Yes, thank you, Jason, for those remarks. And Alan Crowley, I think, echoes a lot of your statements. He says the Bible makes more sense to him when he considers the entire thing metaphorically. And from my standpoint as an atheist, I see the biblical texts as well as, for instance, the Torah and the Quran as being analogous to, for instance, Greek mythology or Viking mythology. They all are accounts of an understanding of the world that originated among certain groups of people, and they blend elements of history and ethical teachings and parables, essentially, that try to arrive at broader lessons for the readers. And to some extent, they are upgrades over the oral traditions where stories were passed down from generation to generation, but they tended to be altered in translation and sometimes exaggerated. And by writing those stories down, they were preserved more consistently across time so that they could be studied more systematically, and a tradition of arriving at insights that are relevant to practical life from them also emerged. We have a comment from our friend Sergei Gutkin, who says, of course, there are and can be Christian transhumanism and Muslim transhumanism. You can be Christian or Muslim and endorse progress, or be an atheist and dream about the good old days like Stalin worshippers, for example. So whether or not one is religious is orthogonal to beliefs in progress as well as how one treats people. So thank you for that comment. And also, TJ Wass points out that right now the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are neutral on cybernetically enhancing humanity with brain chips and mind uploading due to the growing numbers of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. And indeed, the Mormon Transhumanist Association is a prominent example of religious transhumanism during our times. And they are quite numerous in their membership. They're well organized. And that's thanks to the efforts of people like Lincoln Cannon and Carl Youngblood and many others with whom I've had some quite interesting and productive interactions. But it's interesting to see that an active transhumanist subpopulation within a particular larger religious group could eventually influence the policies and official pronouncements of the most prominent organizations within that group. Now, John H., we'd like to also thank you for your generous super chat here. He says, happy Saturnalia. Well, happy Saturnalia back to you as well, John, and whatever you celebrate during this holiday season, it is all good. Now, John has a question for David, and he wonders, shouldn't the idea always be to resolve the apparent oppositions that can sometimes be encountered among people of different persuasions? What do you think about this, David?
Yes, thanks. I'm actually glad somebody raised that question, because continuing to see both sides of an argument as two opposites or as opposites of each other, I think subtly is part of the problem. So getting to a solution requires getting to a destination, getting to an endpoint. My experience in life is that the journey down the road to that endpoint is far more rich and far more enjoyable and helpful than actually even reaching the destination. And as we talk about things in transhumanism, such as exponential change and so forth, plot any exponential function that is going either direction, but let's say it's going towards a positive infinity, no matter how long that function runs, it will never reach the limit. Never will. So the journey is what it's all about. So holding two opposite ideas together to me, it's not to get to that destination of some conclusion as much as it is helping me with the journey of where I'm going. And I hope that's a clear enough answer.
Yes, thank you for that answer, David. And definitely appreciating the intellectual journey is something we all need to do more of, because there is a lot more learning in this life than there is arriving at definitive conclusions that remain in the same form for a long time. Indeed, much of the time we're responding to new empirical data. We're responding to new observations about human beings or developments in the world that we could never have anticipated. And actually, one of the formative reasons for my being in the position I am in right now as chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party is that circa late 2015, early 2016, I realized that my mental landscape of what other people believe, particularly in the political and cultural context, was completely mistaken. I was surprised during the seismic shifts in American politics during that time, particularly brought about by the phenomenon of Donald Trump, where various people aligned versus where I thought they would align. And I realized that there's a lot more ideological flux happening, and many people's positions are not nearly as predictable as I expected them to be. And furthermore, the opposition to Trump, the so-called resistance, disappointed me greatly, almost as much as Trump himself. And I saw as a result of this that there is essentially no other option but to try to create a bastion of the kind of approach to politics that I thought would be constructive and actually could present the possibility of solving the problems that face the American political system, instead of just engaging in this endless antagonism and trench warfare and constant realignments within this tribal structure. So I've seen the political figures on both the right and the left flip-flop so many times on substantive issues just because of their expectations of where the other side was going to stand on those issues. And I wanted something more consistent, more honest, more linked to this intellectual journey, the search for truth, that also enables a common understanding to be formed, bridges to be built, if we're all honest and genuine about what it is that we're seeking, and we do it in a spirit of goodwill. So I appreciate your comments, David. And now I want to get more thoughts from the other panelists. Let's go to Art Ramon Garcia.
This year I had my genealogy done at FamilySearch.com, and they are an LDS site. And as I was going up the tree, I ran into Jesus Christ. So according to the genealogy at the LDS, I'm a living descendant of Jesus Christ. And I Googled that, and apparently there's a lot of royals and presidents who also believe that they're living descendants of Jesus Christ. So what do you think? Do you think Jesus Christ had children and there are living descendants? And if Jesus Christ was not fully human, is there any evidence that they could have in their DNA that Jesus was not fully human?
Very, very interesting. All I have to go on is the gospel records, which portray Jesus as unmarried and not having kids and so forth. People have speculated other things, but I don't have anything to go on with that one way or the other. What I do think, there's been some discussion about the idea of reading the Bible as mythology and metaphor and so forth. And I think this is an important point. because for the last maybe half century, when we have discussions around religion and Christianity, in the United States at least, a lot of those discussions are about, like, well, what really happened, right? Was there a literal Adam and Eve? Did this thing go this way or another way? And there's I like in Genesis, the book of Genesis, there's accounts of people who lived 900 plus years, right? And so if you are to argue about that, you would probably look at that and say, it seems very unlikely that there were people who were living 900 plus years in the ancient world, right? And this is where I think this Jonathan mentioned earlier. He says, well, if Jesus is not who I think he is, then he's at least this archetypal person, right? Like, who has inspired people to live towards a higher vision of ethics and human life, right? And that's got to be true for everything, regardless of what we think did or did not happen. At the least, these are powerful, profound stories that have impacted people for millennia. And we should ask, not first, did it really happen, but what does it mean? What did it mean to those people who wrote it down, who thought it was worth carrying on? And so this idea of, what does it mean that we have this story about Christ being born and so on and so forth? And there were some questions I saw about, like, why would God care about technology, right? Well, this goes back to, like, what is the actual story we're talking about? And the story that Christians have bought into for thousands of years is that we are made to be the children of God and to be transformed into the likeness of God. And so we have all these stories about what that looks like. And so Christ is born, and Christ is transfigured and overcomes death and overcomes gravity and all these things. And we're told that's what it looks like when you, as a human, are glorified and transformed and so forth. And you ask, how are we to do that? And well, the question, it comes down to through the use of human creativity, your God-given creativity, science, technology, art, cooperating with others, building societies. These sorts of things are the way that we actually work towards that kind of transfiguration, that kind of transformation. And we Christians believe God is working through us towards that end, right? So that's the story. So the question of, like, is Christ bringing something genetic into the world or something like that? From a Christian perspective, I'd say it's actually more profound than that. He's bringing an idea of what all humans can become, right? And that's the story. That we're buying into. And the question of, was this in 4 BC? All of that is an interesting question, but it's a secondary question. And that's where I think the U.S. Transhumanist Party needs to be going, is to say, before we start talking about historicity and those things, which can be important and are very important in some key areas, let's talk about what this story means and how those two things, like, come together regardless of where we fall on this question.
Yes, thank you for that response, Micah. And you spoke quite eloquently to the power of ideas. And I agree with you that ideas have a lot more influence in the world than do genetics. For instance, a great philosopher, or even an influencer, to use a more contemporary term, has the ability to shape many more people's lives than somebody who is just a parent of somebody else. And the child could turn out to be very different from the parent. I think we all know situations of that sort. But ideas are extremely powerful, and whether or not they originate from a strictly historical context or are a combination of some historical elements as well as perhaps stories, parables, fiction. Fiction is a great example. Embellishments throughout time. as long as they influence human thinking and influence human behavior, as long as people can derive lessons from those ideas and practical applications, then those ideas are forces that we have to grapple with. And we have to try to understand how they fit into the world as it is today. So from my perspective, there is a certain reality to gods and religions as influences on people's lives. And we have to consider, well, how do those influences evolve over time? How do they interact with other factors in our reality, with scientific advancements, with changes to societal structures, to political structures, to technological realities that affect what humans can do with their bodies, for instance, the ability to lengthen our lifespans and cure diseases. And I know, Newton, you had some comments about Christian futurists, which may dovetail with this strain of the conversation. So please proceed.
Hello, how are you? Wonderful. Yeah, it's great to hear all the opinions and ideas. It's very interesting. I think philosophy and religion are quite unique to human beings because we are made in the image of God. So you don't see animals or even machines talk about philosophy and religions, but we do. Okay, so speaking of futurists, well, obviously Christians are futurists because we think about what's going to happen in the future, not just about us, but also the whole humanity, the universe, the earth, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we also talk about now, right? How are we going to help people now? Because if you look at the gospel of Jesus, you'll see that Jesus talks about a lot of things about what we do now, right? Are you helping the needy people now? It's not sure. We're trying to save everyone as try to preach about Christianity, for example, or other religions, the Buddhism, whatever you have. But the idea is not just to save them from the future, to have a better future, but also now. Are you helping them? Are you making their lives better? And that's exactly what Jesus did, and encourage people to do. In terms of simulation, it's kind of interesting. When we're sleeping, when you're dreaming, you actually don't know that it's a dream. Well, sometimes you do, but a lot of times you don't. You think that is reality. That's why you got scared. You're happy, you laugh, right, in your sleep, in your dreams. So it's possible that we're all in simulation, but doesn't mean that it's not real, because if you hook up, some kind of machines detection device to your brain waves while you're sleeping, you realize that you actually experience fear, you experience happiness, you experience all kinds of things, just as you do in real life. So simulation, again, it can be dream state, can be what we're doing now is a simulation. We don't know. Okay, so it really doesn't matter whether it's reality or you are dreaming when you're sleeping. So I think that the most important thing is about faith, right? Why are we talking about religion? Why are we talking about Christianity? So my background is computer science, and it's interestingly, AI and machine learning strengthened my faith in God, in Jesus. And the reason is because we develop AI programs. Okay, we teach machines how to think for themselves, right? As you do that, you're pretty much creating a new creature. It's just that it is, a machine. It could be biological computer in the future, but still something that we human beings can create. And when you do that, then of course there are other factors involved, like evolution. The machines are learning new things. The machine are coming up with answers that we have never thought about. Just like in quantum mechanics, right? Quantum computers, they can give you answers that we have never dreamed about even. So AI and machine learning, in a sense, mimic. In a sense, they mimic what the relationship between God and human beings. Okay, God created human beings, and human beings create machines. And in that sense, creativity. Somebody mentioned that creativity is indeed the essence. Well, maybe not 100%, but a very important aspect of what it means by the image of God. because animals, they can love, they have emotion, they have fear, they have everything, right? Just like a human being. So they were also created by God because they have all these characteristics. But human beings are more than that. Human beings actually have the desire and the need to create, which is something that God does all the time. Okay, and there's no way in the Bible that says that God didn't create other creatures. Of course, we know that God created angels already, and God created human beings and all the animals on earth and so on. Sure, there may be some other life forms that God created that was never mentioned in the Bible. So back to the AI thing. So we have AI, we have machine learning. Now the question about faith is this: suppose you have a very advanced machine, right? This is about transhumanism, right? We're going to create really advanced machines. The question is this: can machines that we have created now or in the future can prove the existence of human being? You don't know that. How can they prove that we exist? They are not made of flesh and blood. They don't bleed. Okay, they think for themselves. They are not human beings. There are two schools of thoughts about AI anyway. One school of thought is that try to make AI as much as possible like a human being in terms of thinking, in terms of processing, in terms of emotion. Right? That's AGI, artificial general intelligence. The other method is they forget about it. It's basically like Google's the Google what's it called? The Go program. I forgot the name now. So Google invented the chess program, to play Go, right, based on human knowledge. But then they created another version, the zero version, that says throw away all the human knowledge. Go and discover yourself how to play the game. And it did. And it turns out to be better than human knowledge, than database containing human knowledge. So the question is, if the machine, it's called AlphaGo Zero, by the way, I remember that, AlphaGo Zero. So AlphaGo Zero, to me, it's a direction that says that don't try to mimic human beings at all. Try to make a machine think for itself, come up with new ideas. The end goal is still the same, to play the game and win. That's the end goal. So in AGI, the end goal is to have a super intelligence. But why do we have to make super intelligence the same as human beings? Human beings are not super intelligent anyway. So we should just let it go. So in a sense, God created human beings and let us go. In a sense that, we have, of course, we cannot surpass God, okay? But we do have a lot of things that we have done that maybe, God even didn't think that we would have done it, good and bad, right? I mean, that goes back to the question is, why does God allow evil in the world? Well, God may not have thought that we'll create nuclear weapons and use the actual weapons to kill people, all right? I'm not saying that God cannot foresee the future. I'm just saying that that's something that God did not intend to happen. But it did because God let us loose. So here we're going to let AGI loose and to do its own thing. But of course, the thing is that AGI cannot kill people, okay, but cannot harm people. All right, so we do have more control over AGI than God has over human beings. Now, but go back to faith is that can a machine with super intelligence prove that human beings exist? I'm not sure that it can. Not at least not in the way that human beings can accept it. So in a sense that we cannot prove that God exists, we can only do so much. Like, oh, this is beautiful world, and we can see a lot of amazing things. We can think, we believe that God exists. That's all we can do, because it's not like 1 + 1 = 2. Okay. So all I'm saying is that AI and machine learning really strengthen my belief in God and in creationism and evolution. So basically, creationism plus evolution together makes the world go around.
So thank you, Newton, for those comments. And before I invite Jonathan and Micah to respond, I do think that it would be possible for an AI to prove or demonstrate that humans exist, as long as the AI has the ability to take in empirical data and understand content. And I understand that with some of today's systems like GPT-3, there is a serious question of whether or not they actually do understand content, or rather just form syntactically correct phrases using words that they discover through various searches or through their own internal database, but how much do they understand about the reality which those words describe? But provided that an AI could have an understanding of the external world and empirical data, the data that it would take in would suggest that, yes, humans exist, humans interact with it, they have all of these conversations with humans, and there they are, they're physical entities, and the AI has a physical substrate. So there is some sort of common ground on the basis of which evidence for our existence would be apparent to the AIs. But Micah, Jonathan, I would invite you to comment on Newton's remarks.
Just very briefly, I think Newton, you seem to be suggesting the concept of emergence, and so we're going to let the machines go, I think is what you said. And I think that's a tremendous, both a risk and a tremendous opportunity. And I'd just love to see if we can create that AlphaGo scenario and let it play and just see what kind of intelligence emerges, because it could be quite foreign to human intelligence. And we'd need to, I guess, guide its development in to be highly ethical and highly moral. I'll hand over to Micah.
Yeah, so a lot of thoughts are coming up for me, and one is the idea of AI safety, which is a big kind of field and concern that a lot of people have. Like, how do we create AI in such a way that it won't seek to destroy us, and so forth, right? And I like to think about these kinds of problems in terms of the fact that we do have traditional answers to this. We deal with these kinds of problems every time we bring a new human into the world, right? Every new human is also an existential risk, also could destroy us, things like this. So they could be a force for great good or great evil. It's the same kind of question we have with AI. And so I think when we're thinking about, like, how do we deal with that? How do we manage that risk? How do we manage those challenges so that we bring forth the best future possible? I think the Christian answer is that we look for cooperation. We look for relationship. We try to bring new beings forth in the context of relationship so they can learn how to interact and empathize and express things like trust and compassion and cooperation and so forth. And Alan Crowley asked this in the chat: what are the congruencies between Christian thought and building a better nation through using logic, reason, and tech to help human thriving? And I think that the answer is the same, right? That we the Christian answer to how do you do these things? How do you wield the kinds of power that we have access to as members of a technological civilization? It's relationship. It's building communities, strong communities, and strong relationships that can help us to build trust, build cooperation, build compassion with each other so that we can handle the risks, that we can overcome the challenges. I think that's really what it comes down to. And that's why I don't think we should start with saying, how do we build a better world through logic and reason? That should be our second question. But the first question is, like, what are we trying to do? And the answer to that is build a better world, right? Build a better world for us all. And once we have accepted that, then we have good reason to bring that kind of stuff together. But that kind of idea, we're trying to build a better world, is ultimately a relational idea. It goes to the question of, like, what kinds of relationships do we want to exist in? And I think that really needs to be on the forefront of political and economic and technological thinking as we bring new kinds of beings, new kinds of intelligence into the world. We need to be thinking about that relational aspect. How are we going to manage relationally? We've already seen just in the last decade the kinds of problems that technology technology can unleash in the world, and in terms of our social structure, our social fabric, right? It creates these kinds of complexities. We need stronger and better relationships to overcome those challenges. And I think that's where we need to start.
Yes, thank you, Micah, for those comments. And it does seem that we have shared challenges that we need to overcome, and people of all perspectives, of all worldviews can contribute to that as long as they have a solution-oriented mindset. And in some circles, fashionable circles today, this may be derided as solutionism, but from my standpoint, I proudly embrace solutionism, because if we aren't talking about solutions to our problems, then what are we doing? Are we being professional cynics or fashionable cynics? And I definitely don't want to be in that position. I want to build a better world. And now let's go to Ben Ballweg for his questions or comments.
Thanks, Micah and Jonathan, both for being here today. First, what I was wondering most coming into this was how transhumanists could be accused of playing God by trying to extend life indefinitely. But I think what I'm hearing you answer to that, Micah, is that like through the Our Father with on earth as it is in heaven, and that God intended us to approximate him as much as we are able. And so maybe that's the answer that I would have to someone that asked me about, aren't you playing God? So please clarify on that. And then the second one, a little bit of a palate cleanser. I was kind of wondering, so there has to be a breadth of thought from Christian transhumanists about what's going on with the soul when someone is in cryopreservation. Is it somewhat activated, or is it still totally like out, or what's going on there? So those two questions, please.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the question of playing God, it's a weird sort of pejorative that really doesn't make very much sense within the Christian story at all, because what Christianity says, what the Bible says, is that we're children of God. So, and our ethical duty is to imitate God. Jesus famously says that we should love our enemies. Why does he say that? He says, because God loves his enemies, and you are ethically called to imitate God. That's the ethical basis of Christian thought. So we are called to imitate God. I mentioned before, first page of the Bible, Genesis 1 says God made us in his image and likeness and called us to do those same sorts of creative, cultivating, scientific, technological work that God himself had kind of portrayed, right? In the actual story, so, God goes through and names different parts of creation and then calls humans and says, okay, I'm going to bring creation to you and you're going to name it, right? So he's leading them into this imitation of his own work. It's very clear when you read the biblical story. So yeah, that's where we start. I think what people really are saying when they say, playing God, is that they're saying being reckless with power, right? That's what they're talking about. And we have to be very careful about being reckless with power. So, what sometimes I say to other Christians is, in a sense, we need to be playing God in the sense that we don't need to be playing the devil, right? We need to be imitating God and God's way of using power, not the devil and the devil's way of using power. We need to be imitating Christ and Christ's way of using power. That's the Christian idea. So that's Christ is not without power. God is not without power, but Christ uses that power for good, for compassion, for trust, and so forth. And that's what we always need to be saying. Now, in terms of what is happening with the soul during cryonic preservation, I don't know. And, there are different kinds of speculations about that. One speculation that's out there that people talk about is like when people are dead in the ground, maybe their souls are kind of sleeping and waiting until the resurrection, or maybe they're doing something else. I don't know. But what I do know is at least as early as 1968, Christianity Today was endorsing cryonics as a conservative Christian option. It's certainly not something that's, even though we might raise all kinds of metaphysical questions, it's not outside of the realm of Christian thought or Christian possibility. Whatever the soul's doing while we're frozen, it'll be fine when we bring it back. And Christians have been having those kinds of discussions for 2,000 years, but they still, at the end of the day, said, yeah, at the end of the day, we can figure out how to put the soul and the body back together and it'll be fine.
Thank you, Micah, for those responses. And we're coming up to the time in our Virtual Enlightenment Salon where I would invite final statements, both from you, Micah, and from Jonathan in the next 5 minutes. What would you like to add to our conversation? How would you like to sum it up or perhaps take it further? And what words would you offer to our listeners as to what they can do to learn more about Christian transhumanism and contribute to the aims of Christian transhumanism?
Look, as Micah said, Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, and a big part of loving our enemies is not straw-manning their ideas. And I see Christians on one fringe straw-manning transhumanist ideas, and I see transhumanists and atheists straw-manning Christians' ideas. There's 780,000 words in the Bible, but you can summarize it to one sentence by saying we're living in a fallen human creation, that the Old Testament shows us that laws aren't going to fix the human condition, and what we need in the New Testament is a spiritual transformation that we will all transcend and become what we're intended to be originally, in the image of God. So that I think is the positive message that Christians and transhumanists can unite around. I'll hand over to Micah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a Christian perspective, this is the idea that humans are made in the image of God, the likeness of God. We're called to imitate God. Part of that is our creative nature, our ability to use science and technology to bring life into the world, to cultivate life, to bring about new art and science and technology and ways of living and organizing ourselves and so forth. And the question that is raised in scriptures is, how do we deal with that power without destroying ourselves? And the answer is ultimately it's relational. It's about being connected to each other through love, through compassion, through trust, and about seeking to be that kind of a creator in a technological way, the same kind of creator that in essence we see God being, we see Christ being in Scripture. And so I would say for transhumanists, this kind of story is where we should start the dialogue, right? We both believe in a transformative, incredible future. We both believe in the potential for human transformation. We both believe in the potential for a radically different world. We both believe, in essence, that our identity is not defined by kind of our current status, what we currently see. It's defined by what we can become. And I think starting with those things and building out ways of understanding and ways of cooperating and ways of trusting and ways of working across different understandings, building those bridges that were talked about. I think that's really where we should go and focus. So, I really appreciate this discussion. I appreciate everyone with your thoughts and questions. And I know these things are challenging. And so being able to tackle them is a big deal and is something to be commended for. And I would say, if you want to find out more about this or get involved, ChristianTranshumanism.org is our website. We have links to a bunch of stuff, discussions, and so forth. And probably our most active discussion area right now is our Facebook group. And you can join in there and talk to other Christian transhumanists and find out how they think about things and the diversity of thought in the Christian transhumanist world as well. So, but yeah, I just appreciate being able to have the discussion, and thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you very much, Micah, for joining us today, and Jonathan as well, and also to all of our panelists from the U.S. Transhumanist Party. As always, we provide a forum for thoughtful discussion, for considering a variety of perspectives, for making bridges across various intellectual disciplines, all for the improvement of the human condition, and as several of our viewers observed, for the purpose of re-intellectualizing politics, which is vital for the continued advancement of the human species, as well as avoiding many problematic scenarios for our future. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Until next Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific time, live long and prosper.